39 years of marriage, can you imagine how much it is? It's a big half of a life spent together. I dreamed of living to the end with my wife, with whom we have been together for many years. My friends and colleagues envied me because I had a really strong marriage, but it only seemed so at first glance. "Hell yeah!" I exclaimed into my mobile phone as I drove west on I-70, around 2 hours away from Columbus. On a gorgeous sunny July Sunday. I had to shout into the phone. I was cruising down the highway at 70 miles per hour with both windows rolled down and the sunroof open. The car sounded like a wind tunnel, yet the engine purred, and it handled as smoothly as a much pricier vehicle. It was a 1996 Ford Probe, one of Detroit's finest bang-for-your-buck cars, and it was mine. A retirement present from my wife that I had just picked up in Washington, D.C. the day before. "This is incredible," I shouted to my wife, Tracy. "This might just be the best gift anyone's ever given me." "I'm glad you're enjoying it. Just be careful not to have too much fun and end up with a hefty speeding ticket. I won't be paying for those," she said cheerfully. "No worries, babe. I'm only 10 over the limit and the road's pretty clear. I think I'm in the clear." "All right then. I'll see you tomorrow evening," she said before hanging up. I tossed my phone onto the vacant passenger seat and let out a joyous scream. Woo-hoo! I had been driving for approximately 5 hours, intending to stop at Columbus for dinner and spend the night as part of my plan. I had already made a hotel reservation. At 63, I didn't anticipate being capable of enduring a 12-hour drive in a single day, as I might have at 35 or even 45. If Tracy had been with me, we would have shared the driving, and likely completed it in one day. However, for this particular trip, I was traveling alone. I've been a fan of the Probe since I test drove one back in 1988. Most dealerships in my area had received one as a debut model to launch the newest Ford for the 1989 model year. I was drawn to its appearance from the moment I laid eyes on it, but I waited a week before visiting the nearby Ford dealership to take it for a test drive. It was love at first drive. The original Probe engine, made by Mazda, was both quick and powerful, offered great mileage, and had incredibly responsive, race car-like handling. Just a slight movement of the steering wheel would cause the car to shift a foot on the road. It was truly impressive. I drove my first car for 11 years, followed by another 11 with the second one. I purchased the second car in 1997, its final model year, and covered nearly 220,000 miles before it was totaled in an accident caused by someone else. Despite attempts to find replacements on eBay and similar platforms, I was unsuccessful. Consequently, for the past 2 years, I reluctantly drove what I considered to be just another ordinary car. Last week, I retired from a 40-year career in the insurance industry, where I toiled as one of the countless anonymous faces in a cubicle. Though the work was often monotonous, the compensation was sufficient, evidenced by my early retirement a couple of years shy of turning 65. My colleagues organized a small farewell ceremony, attended by my wife. They presented me with thoughtful parting gifts, but the highlight came when my wife presented me with a key, one of my old Probe keys, accompanied by a note. It turned out that she and my son-in-law had been searching for a Probe on my behalf, and had located one in excellent condition, with just 100,000 miles on the odometer, near Washington, D.C. The plan for the weekend was that I would fly into D.C. and spend a day and a half with the kids and grandkids. Then, after lunch on Sunday, I was supposed to drive approximately 7 hours to Columbus, stay overnight, and complete the rest of the journey after breakfast on Monday, arriving home early afternoon. Initially, I was puzzled why Tracy had reserved a hotel for Sunday, because I thought she was joining me, and we would drive straight through. However, she informed me that this trip I would be traveling solo so I could do all the driving and get acquainted with my new car, a black GT Turbo. In 1990, Ford had switched to manufacturing Probe engines, and the only way they could match the performance of the Mazda engine was by installing a turbocharged V6. It certainly roared, but it was no longer as fuel-efficient as the Mazda 4-cylinder. A significant portion of the initial leg of the journey took us through the mountains of West Virginia, an experience that's always exhilarating yet potentially hazardous. Maneuvering through 2 or 3 lanes of traffic, disregarding the 70 mph speed limit, contending with imposing semis, navigating sharp curves, and dealing with erratic lane changes can make it seem like chaos, not suited for the faint-hearted. Drawing from my past experiences with 2 previous probes, I trust this car to handle whatever challenges arise, and personally, I find the mountainous terrain thrilling. However, once past that stretch, it's mostly straight highway, which tends to be monotonous since I can't push the car to its limits like I'd prefer. Typically, the speed limit drops to 60 or 65, meaning I'd naturally exceed it by going 70 or 75, but even then, vigilance is essential due to law enforcement presence, especially in Ohio. After chatting with Tracy, I pulled into a gas station and after filling up, popped into the convenience store for a soda. The cashier glanced at me, then at my car. "That's a real beauty, sir. That's a probe, isn't it?" I was impressed by his knowledge, considering he likely wasn't even born when they ceased production of the car. "Yes, it is," I replied proudly, towering at my 5'11" stature. "A retirement gift I picked up in D.C. yesterday. Headed back to Illinois. Wow, she's really nice." I nodded at the young cashier and confidently made my way back to my car. Just for his sake, I lingered on the clutch for a moment, then shifted into gear and lightly squealed the tires, a feat not always easy with a front-wheel drive vehicle. As I drove, I replayed the weekend in my mind. I had enjoyed quality time with my daughter, her husband, and my only grandchild. Now that I was retired, I silently promised myself to spend more time with the little guy in person. Seeing him on FaceTime was nice, but nothing beat being there in the flesh. I passed by a car that seemed to be occupied by teenage girls. They greeted me with a honk as I sped by, my flowing gray hair caught in the wind. Glancing briefly at the girl behind the wheel, she evoked memories of my Tracy in her youth. Long blonde hair, a graceful silhouette, and what I believe were blue eyes. Ah, my Tracy, the hostess of this event, if you like. Not exactly the way I saw her for the first time at the age of 19, but still an amazing woman at 63. Of course, she may weigh an extra 20 pounds, and her blonde hair is probably more bottled than natural, but she still attracts the attention of our peers and even some young people. Last fall, I thought about taking her to the opening of the museum, where she dared to do more by wearing a rather revealing pink sweater. I knew she was a little embarrassed to appear in such an outfit in public, but she did it because she knew that I adore this image. In response, I expressed my gratitude to her, giving her an unforgettable night. I first encountered Tracy during my second year at Indiana State University. She had just moved into the dormitory where I had resided for the past 2 years. While playing frisbee outside with some fellow residents, Tracy arrived with her parents to settle in. The moment I laid eyes on her, I was captivated, a fact made evident when one of my friends accidentally hit me with a throw while I was lost in admiration. Ceasing my game, I approached Tracy and her family, offering assistance. However, her father, upon glimpsing my long, curly hair, reacted with disdain and politely declined. Taking the cue, I retreated. A week later, I encountered her in the dormitory and introduced myself. Sensing her lack of enthusiasm, I promptly disengaged and departed the scene. 2 weeks afterward, I spotted her strolling hand-in-hand with a guy from the dormitory, residing 2 floors above me. He appeared to be a geek sporting a short, bristly mustache. Clearly, I wasn't her type, but it didn't bother me in the slightest. I'd occasionally encounter her in the dormitory and engage in polite small talk. Since she wasn't part of my social circle, I had no compelling reason to interact with her. She showed no interest, and I wasn't inclined to invest any effort in pursuing her. While I may not have been a romantic ideal, I fared well with other girls and had no need to tolerate anyone's attitude. 2 years later, she showed up at a pre-semester party thrown by some friends. Mr. Bristly Mustache had already graduated, and she came alone. I thought I'd give it another try, and if met with rejection or attitude, I'd move on. No harm, no foul. Tracy was a business major at a time when there weren't many women in the field. Most of the business majors on my floor saw her as assertive, though they couldn't quite explain why since she didn't talk much. Knowing some of those guys, I suspected they were simply intimidated by her intelligence and her refusal to conform to the traditional norms of the business world. When I approached her, I didn't have high expectations, but it was clear that she wasn't comfortable being alone in a crowded room, as she appeared quite nervous when I came over. Her reaction was as if I had startled a drowning person by offering assistance. "Do you always take 2 beers?" she remarked sharply, eyeing the cups in each of my hands. I almost retorted with a sarcastic remark, but for some reason I chose to restrain myself. "Pretty much," I replied casually. "I'm fairly ambidextrous, so I don't like to play favorites." She gave a slight shake of her head, and as I started to walk away, she unexpectedly placed her left hand on my right forearm to halt me, stepping into my personal space. I was taken aback as I towered over her at 5'1". Rising onto her tiptoes, she grabbed a handful of curls on each of my shoulders, pulling my face down to hers before softly planting a sensual kiss on my lips. When she took a step back, standing on tiptoe, I was fascinated by her gentle blue gaze. Closing the distance, I hugged her and kissed her gently, trying not to spill a drop of beer. We left the party together and spent the next 2 hours talking, just talking, in a dimly lit corner of the dorm living room. From that moment on, we were inseparable and eventually got married shortly after graduation. Although her parents weren't thrilled with her choice, I didn't give a damn about their opinion. After graduation, we both found good jobs, and everything was going well. Our bedtime life remained intense, although it became less frequent compared to when we were in college. Allison came into our lives 3 years into our marriage. She brought immense joy to both of us, and there were occasions when we playfully vied for the chance to hold her. This friendly competition only intensified when we visited either set of grandparents. I'm convinced that during her first 2 years, Allison scarcely touched the ground whenever we were at their homes. Reflecting on those early years brought a smile to my face. As I glanced up, I noticed I was nearing the first exit for Columbus. Disregarding it, I felt a strong desire to continue driving, eager to return home to my wife, Tracy. Sacrificing the hotel reservation seemed insignificant compared to the prospect of being with her sooner. Pulling over, I promptly canceled the room and contemplated calling Tracy. However, I opted for the element of surprise, planning to arrive home in the dead of night and slip into bed beside her. 2 hours after Columbus, I went to one of the rest stop restaurants. While there, I called Tracy, pretending to be calling from my hotel room to check on her. It was obvious that she had forgotten her phone somewhere and hurried to get it, because when she answered, her voice was slightly out of breath. "Hey, save that breath for me tomorrow," I joked when she picked up the phone. "Of course, honey," she replied. "I really missed you." It was a nice statement. We chatted for a few more minutes, then I promised to see her tomorrow afternoon. Was all she muttered before we hung up. After quickly finishing my dinner and refueling, I set off again. Since the windows and the sunroof were closed for the night, the gust of wind no longer howled in my ears. The sensor worked smoothly. I couldn't help but smile at the thought of my wife and son-in-law giving me the same test. 39 wonderful years. Where did all that time go? Around 1:30 a.m., I arrived in Normal and reached my house by about 1:45. I had left my Ford Taurus parked on the street so I could bring my new acquisition into the garage. Armed with the garage remote, I cautiously made my way up the driveway, only to discover someone else's vehicle occupying my designated spot, right beside my wife's car. In that moment, I experienced a sudden surge of panic, my limbs tingling with what felt like the onset of a heart attack, accompanied by profuse sweating. However, after a deep breath, the symptoms subsided. Yet the unfamiliar car remained, leaving me struggling to gather my thoughts. My memory fades momentarily as I turned off the probe. Stunned, I sat there staring at the Mercedes occupying my space. Eventually, I ventured into the garage, opened the passenger door of the intruding car, and located the registration in the glove box. To my dismay, it belonged to Ralph Pruitt, who, until retiring 6 months ago, had been Tracy's boss for the past decade. Damn it. At this juncture, my initial inclination was to surreptitiously enter the house. retrieve my Sig Sauer 9mm, and eliminate them both. Then I thought about just getting into a physical confrontation with them. In the end, I decided it was extremely unwise to go to jail. They weren't worth it. Silently, I ventured into the house. The atmosphere was eerily quiet as I ascended the stairs towards the master bedroom. The door, as usual, was locked, so I carefully unlocked it and entered. There, in my own bed, lay Tracy and Ralph Pruitt, with my wife nestled into his right shoulder, his arm draped around her, a position reminiscent of how Tracy and I often slept. The familiarity of their embrace suggested that this wasn't a one-time occurrence. I must take a moment to commend the iPhone 11's night mode feature. The 2 photographs I captured of them in the dimly lit room turned out stunningly. After stowing my phone, I quietly retrieved enough clothing from my drawers and closet to last several days. Finding a suitcase in the hallway closet, I hastily packed my belongings. Returning for my firearm, I departed. Re-entering through the garage, I unfolded my knife and slashed all 4 tires of both his and Tracy's vehicles. Climbing into my probe, I drove to a spot down the street and observed. Tracy, being retired, had no need to rise early, but Ralph, with work obligations, had to leave my premises early enough to avoid detection by neighbors. Hence, it came as no surprise when the garage door lifted at 5:07 a.m. Likewise, it was unsurprising when Ralph's car failed to emerge. With all 4 tires flattened, the vehicle sat level. Unless Ralph was specifically scrutinizing the ground, he wouldn't have noticed the damage. However, his car's sensors would have promptly alerted him upon starting the engine. From where I was parked, I couldn't observe the activity in the garage. However, around 8:30, a truck from Fred's tire barn arrived, transporting 8 new tires. I cynically pondered whether Ralph footed the bill for Tracy's tires, or if she had to cover the cost herself. I also questioned whether they would be foolish enough to involve the police. Even though they had no knowledge of my involvement in the damage, calling law enforcement would have entailed numerous inquiries, especially considering I was expected home early afternoon. After Ralph departed around 10, I assumed Tracy went into overdrive to change the bed linens and purge the house of any traces of Ralph. I departed, hitting the road toward Omaha, NB, deciding it was time to pay a visit to a long-term friend residing there. Tracy finally called when I didn't arrive at 3. "Yeah," I responded shortly, holding the phone to my ear. Since the Proby was an older car without Bluetooth, I mentally noted to fix that soon. "Where are you?" "You're supposed to be home," she asked cautiously. "I'm in the middle of Iowa on I-80 heading to Spence's," I replied monotonously. "What are you doing in Iowa? I know you enjoy driving, but do you love that car more than me?" "Right now, yes," I truthfully replied before hanging up. I pulled over, sent her a photo of herself and Ralph sleeping in our bed. I received no response. Resuming my journey, I pressed down on the accelerator. Spencer and Marianne endured my grumpiness for 3 days after I updated them on what had happened. It was comforting to be with longtime friends during a tough time. I didn't say much for the rest of the visit after my initial sharing, but with old friends, words aren't always necessary to convey love and support. As I prepared to leave, Marianne hugged me tightly and whispered in my ear that she and Spence always had space for me no matter what. This trip back home lacked the excitement of my previous drives. I don't think I ever exceeded the speed limit in the probe, as I needed the usual 6+ hours of driving to process my grief and thoughts. I mourned the loss of my marriage, as by this point I was fairly certain we wouldn't be celebrating our 40th anniversary together. I found myself asking the usual set of questions. Did I make any mistakes? Could I not satisfy Tracy in bed? Was I ignored by another man? And what would my life be like without Tracy after so many years? The thought even fleetingly crossed my mind of forgiving her and maintaining our marriage, if she desired it, but I promptly dismissed it. Deep down, I knew I could never erase the image of them together in our bed. If you can't forget, you haven't truly forgiven. I foresaw a future of bitterness and resentment if I remained, as opposed to the bitter but liberated path of divorce. "Arr!" I screamed inwardly. This time, Tracy's Lincoln was the only car in the garage as I raised the door remotely. I retrieved my bags from the trunk and entered the house to find Tracy curled up on the family room sofa, a glass of red wine beside her left hand. Seizing the moment, I fetched a Corona from the fridge and settled into my recliner. We locked eyes, and I noticed tears beginning to form. Raising my right hand in a calming gesture, I could see the distress in her expression as she sat up slightly, but she didn't burst into tears. I pleaded, "Please refrain. You know I detest your poor me act, and in this scenario, if anyone has a right to cry, it's me. How could you do this? To us. To me. 39 years vanished. In an instant." I believe some of it was genuine, perhaps the initial 10 or 20 years. When did your feelings for me change? "Andy, I've never stopped loving you," she murmured. "My love for you is stronger than ever, but I've caused you immeasurable pain, and I'm unsure how to ease it. You may believe you still love me, and perhaps there's some residue, but it's not as fervent as it once was, or you wouldn't have done this to me. Never. So, tell me, how long has this been going on? Spare me the notion it was a one-time occurrence. Your affair suggests it's been happening more than sporadically. Are there others? Did you cheat on me with our friends?" As I posed my final question, her expression morphed from fear to anger. I pondered if I had touched upon a sensitive truth. "How could you insinuate that I've slept with any of our friends, as if I'm some sort of promiscuous person?" she began, her voice laden with indignation. "Seems like the accusation isn't too far off, darling," I interjected. She emitted a disgruntled noise and fell silent. Her gaze turned cautious, almost as though she feared I might lash out at her. She understands me far better than that, and if she were truly rational, she would know I'd never lay a hand on her, regardless of the emotions displayed on my face. "There's only been one," she started, then halted, realizing I might uncover her deception. Sometimes, when deeply entrenched, honesty is the only recourse. "He's the sole one," she amended. "It's been ongoing for quite some time, maybe 5 or 6 years. I felt lightheaded. I'm sure my eyebrows shot up at the mention of the time frame. "Once or sometimes twice a week once we hit our stride, and usually for several nights when you were away on a business trip," she stated matter-of-factly, devoid of emotion, as if she were discussing a topic in math or history. It amounted to once or twice a week, along with trips over the course of 5 or 6 years. Damn, either I'm a top-tier idiot or the most trusting guy on the planet. "It's not like you made it difficult," she added. "You trusted me completely, so all I had to do was provide a reasonable excuse to explain my time." "Well, excuse me for fully trusting my wife of over 30 years, I retorted, tilting my head back and finishing the rest of my beer. As I rose to fetch another beer, I noticed her glass was also empty. "Another?" I asked. "Yes, please," she replied cheerfully. I grabbed a fresh beer for myself and refilled her wine glass before settling back into my chair, leaning forward. "Why didn't you just tell me you were unhappy? I could have made changes. At the very least, we could have parted somewhat amicably," I suggested. "But I'm not unhappy and I don't want a divorce," she stated blandly. "I've already told you, I love you, and I truly meant it. I want us to grow old together." I'm sure my expression conveyed more than a hint of confusion to her. "Listen, Alice, this isn't Wonderland. You don't get to deceive me with a lover for years, then expect me to sweep you off to Foreverland on my white horse. Real life, at least in my experience, doesn't operate like that." "And that's precisely why we're having this conversation, Andrew," she retorted, using my formal name, a sign of her irritation or anger towards me. "You're intelligent, and there's no reason we can't find a resolution to this, even if it means I have to let go of Ralph. I'm sincere, Andy. I love you, and only you. What Ralph and I share is purely physical. I suppose you could just call it intimacy. Admittedly, a very pleasant intimacy, but still just intimacy. What we have goes much deeper. Why would you want to throw it away at this stage?" I sat there stunned, bewildered, and at a loss for words. Could she truly be so indifferent to her actions? Who took my wife's spirit when I wasn't looking? "Wait a damn minute," I croaked. Do you really believe that I'm going to let you keep sleeping with Ralph? Andy, when you say that, it sounds so rude, she retorted fiercely. Because it's rude, I immediately fought back. What happened to the loving woman I married 39 years ago and who promised to be faithful until death do us part? Tracy, you've had affairs, novels, for 5 or 6 years, and you don't think it's that important? Seriously? What's going on with you, baby? She took a sip of wine, and I looked at her carefully. Oh my God, I'm lucky. At 63, she looked no older than 53, and she had the figure of a 43-year-old woman. And that was the problem that I was just about to discover. Do you remember how a few years after I went through menopause, you noticed that I seemed to have regained a lot of my strength? I nodded in agreement. Both of us were astounded by her rejuvenation, so to speak, and we've been thoroughly enjoying it. Her doctor had even coined a term for it, though I couldn't recall it at the moment. He mentioned that about 10% of women undergo this phenomenon later in life, while for many couples, when husbands face a decrease in bed desire, little can change. When Tracy started experiencing this, I sought medical help from my doctor to support her newfound energy, which allowed us both to enjoy these years. Surprisingly, our bed life was quite satisfactory, despite our advanced age. During this period, Ralph had been showering me with compliments, remarking on my radiant appearance and newfound energy. By then, we had been colleagues for about 4 years and had developed a close friendship. We even engaged in some harmless flirting, which initially felt refreshing, to know that a man could still find me attractive and flirtatious at this stage of life. Wait a moment, I interjected. I've always told you that you exuded immense sensuality, and I've often pursued you hoping to take our relationship to a more intimate level. Didn't that count for anything? You are my husband. Such words are expected of you, she said. But it was a completely different person, a friend who seemed genuinely interested in me, and to be honest, it was exciting. A few months later, you had to go on a short business trip to Houston, I think for the weekend, and I'm not really sure why, but I ended up inviting Ralph to dinner that Saturday night. One thing led to another, and I took him upstairs, and for the first time we became close. It was amazing and incredibly exciting. I knew that part of this excitement was caused by the fact that it was wrong and he was something new and unusual for me, but it was still an unforgettable experience. Later, we went to the second round and then slept for a few hours before he left. Whenever he came, we put his car in the garage, and he always left early in the morning so that the neighbors wouldn't see him. We've always tried to be careful. I couldn't help but snort when I heard that. So who were you trying to show respect to? The neighbors. Because of course you weren't trying to show respect to me. That guy over there is with my wife in our bed, and you're telling me you're showing respect. She shivered uncomfortably and took another sip of wine. I must admit, I was surprised that I didn't wake up feeling guilty for what I had done. The only time I felt guilty was when you came home that night. I've been avoiding you for days, wondering if you can see it written on my skin like dirt. But since you didn't know, and technically I didn't give him any of your stuff, I stopped feeling guilty. So it became almost easy to come back a second and then a third time. I just had to be careful not to hurt you. But you gave him something from me, I said. Although ultimately this is your body, and you can do whatever you want with it, you gave it the loyalty that you promised to keep only to me. I took our vows seriously more than 39 years ago, without even imagining that they had an expiration date. I think it must have been hidden somewhere in the small print. You're exaggerating, Andy. Have you thought about it? What would we both gain if we broke up? Living somewhere in an apartment for the elderly, alone. What's the point of that? I love you, Andy. And even though you're mad at me right now, I know you love me too. If you don't want me to see Ralph anymore, I can agree. As my anger surged, I sensed my blood pressure spiking. We seemed to be having a discussion about whether we would remain together, but she seemed to believe it was about whether I would tolerate her relationship with Ralph. Unbelievable. I don't want you to continue seeing Ralph, at least while we're still married, I shouted at her. Once we're divorced, you can see him as much as you like for all I care. Divorce? "That's not happening, Andy," she casually replied. I rose from my seat, hastily packed some clean clothes into my suitcase, grabbed a few personal items, and left. I got into the probe and drove to a nearby budget motel to spend the next few days. Tracy's attitude left me utterly bewildered. How can you not know someone after being married to them for 39 years? The following morning, bright and early, I phoned Willie Joseph, a longtime friend and lawyer, and arranged to meet him for lunch, my treat. We opted for an Italian eatery where, over a veal and pepper sandwich, I recounted my unfortunate tale. Willie and I go way back to our college years at Indiana State, and he's been acquainted with Tracy since we first began dating. We've even socialized with him and his wife, Ada, on several occasions. "Do you think she might be experiencing some form of early-onset dementia?" "This doesn't sound like the Tracy I know," he suggested. "Exactly," was my sole reply. I understand some might see me as weak, but I instructed Willie to divide everything as fairly as possible. After all, she had been with me for 39 years. There was no need for me to suddenly become ruthless. I asked Willie to give her the fully paid house and compensate me with the equivalent amount in cash. I knew I could never return to that house without imagining them together in our bed. "Do you really think there's no chance to reconcile, man? You've been together for ages, growing old side by side." I could tell this was as painful for him as it was for me. "Is the usual 2 weeks okay for the paperwork, Andy?" he casually asked. "Well, actually, Willie, I was hoping for a favor on that, and I'm willing to pay extra for it. Can you have her served by Friday?" "What?" "If you're not harboring resentment, why rush it? You haven't even been to the bank or done any of the other things I told you were necessary." "I just can't stand her attitude, Willie. She's actually optimistic. I'll change my mind and let her continue with this Ralph guy." "Whoa," he exclaimed. "That's messed up. Friday soon enough?" "That should make it clear I'm dead serious, Willie." Over the next few days, I received the anticipated phone calls and messages from Tracy. I chose not to respond to either, though her voicemails and texts conveyed her longing for me, apologies for hurting me, and accusations of my stubbornness and immaturity. I couldn't help but notice the absence of an apology for her actions towards me and our relationship. On Tuesday night, I phoned my daughter Allison and son-in-law Ron to inform them about the divorce and the specific reason behind it. They seemed just as shocked as I was to hear about the affair, which reassured my paranoid mind that there was no conspiracy against me. Tears were shed, and after about 10 minutes, Allison asked if there was any chance of reconciliation. "You two have been married for so long. You're both retired now. This should be the time to relax together by the fireplace with a drink," she suggested. "That was the plan, sweetheart, but your mother seems to have different ideas. She believes that once I get over my anger, everything will be fine. But this wasn't just a one-time mistake. They've been having an affair for over 5 years, and they've even been intimate in our own bed. In fact, that's how I discovered them." I swiftly sent the sleeping lovebirds photo to my daughter's phone. I heard the notification sound followed by a sharp intake of breath from both her and Ron. I'll never be able to erase that image from my mind. I know the memory will eventually fade, but the pain will linger. "But it's been 39 years, Dad," she complained. "Ron, if you were in this situation with Allison, would you even consider forgiving her after a 5 or 6 year affair?" There was silence on the other end of the phone. I could imagine my daughter glaring at Ron, trying to coax a conciliatory response out of him, but I knew Ron was steadfast in his beliefs. "No, Dad, I wouldn't forgive her, and I wouldn't rule out physical violence either," he finally replied. "Ron," Allison exclaimed. "I'm just being honest, Allie," Ron retorted. "If you ever did that to me, I'd feel like you killed me, at least metaphorically." Around noon on Friday, Willie phoned to inform me that Tracy had been served. According to his process server, Tracy appeared shocked and then devastated. I arrived at the house around 2 p.m. to gather some additional belongings. Tracy was seated at the kitchen table, holding a glass of wine with a half-empty bottle beside her. As I passed through the kitchen toward the stairs, she whispered angrily, "You spiteful jerk. 4 days, and you're already scouting nursing homes?" "I've made myself clear, Andy," she continued. "There will be no divorce. You're going to face this head-on. We'll overcome it, and we'll spend the rest of our lives together. I love you. This changes nothing." "That's not being resilient, Tracy. That's resigning to being a cuckold, and I won't accept that. You've violated our vows repeatedly, and just because we're older, you expect me to forgive and forget. Well, I won't forgive. I won't forget. It's not happening. Tracy, I'm certain you still harbor some love for me, but it's not the all-encompassing love it once was. Not since Ralph entered the picture. I was completely devoted to you. There was no backup plan, no alternative. It was just us. But now it's you, me, Ralph, and whoever comes next after Ralph." She sobbed gently now. A large part of me yearned to embrace her tightly and reassure her that everything would be okay. My love for her persisted. After all, we had been married for 39 years. Love doesn't simply vanish like flipping a switch. However, the shattered piece of my heart resisted the urge to lash out with hurtful words. I ascended the stairs. Tracy contested the divorce, and her lawyer persuaded the judge to mandate 12 counseling sessions. Willie advised me to comply and stay silent, warning that angering the judge would only prolong the process. We both arrived a few minutes early for our initial session. Tracy attempted to strike up a conversation in Dr. Ruth Swearingham's waiting room, but I kept my responses curt, wanting no part of it. Finally, Dr. Swearingham, she insisted on not being called Dr. Ruth, emerged from her office and guided us in. Despite being offered drinks, we both declined. Then, the doctor outlined the rules. No shouting, name-calling, swearing, or interrupting. A first offense warranted a warning. A second would be reported to the judge as insubordination, with appropriate measures taken. I pondered what those measures might entail until Dr. Swearingham suggested it might be wise for me to pay attention to others when I wasn't speaking. Message received. As the aggrieved party, I was given the opportunity to present my perspective first. Throughout most of it, Tracy sat restlessly, occasionally attempting to interject, only to be halted by the counselor. When Tracy finally recounted her version of events, it closely aligned with mine, but differed in some aspects. Notably, she portrayed seeking solace in a new confidant due to my demanding work schedule. When I had the chance to rebut, I clarified to the counselor that my absence from home was minimal, typically just a few days per month, thus invalidating Tracy's claim of loneliness. Dr. Swearingham acknowledged my point with a nod and jotted something down in her notebook. Dr. Swearingham inquired about the potential outcomes of a divorce. "Do you seek victory in this, Mr. English?" "No, doctor. I'm not aiming for victory," I replied wearily. "I don't believe there's any victory to be had here, only loss. I'm simply trying to mitigate my losses. I've lost the person who has been at the core of my existence for over 39 years. Everything revolved around her. But now that's gone, and it can never be replaced. I'll likely end up as a lonely old man because the person I held above all others didn't value our relationship enough to remain faithful for over 5 years. That sounds quite intense, Mr. English. You don't strike me as someone who exaggerates. Why is this hitting you so hard now?" "You're correct, Doctor. I'm typically quite reserved. But this is an exceptional circumstance for me. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that she shattered my heart and my world. A few weeks ago, I felt like I was on top of the world. I had just retired, received a car I adored as a gift from the woman who loves me, and we were preparing to embark on a journey across the country, exploring museums, zoos, and anything else that caught our interest. It was me and the woman I loved, and who loved me in return. But then I discovered that the depth of affection I felt wasn't reciprocated in the same way by her. For 30 seconds, the room fell into complete silence, with only the steady ticking of the wall clock breaking it. Finally, Dr. Swearingham turned to Tracy, asking for her perspective. "Firstly, I want to say that I love you with all my heart, Andy. My feelings for you haven't diminished in any way. This isn't about love, it's just about physical intimacy. I've been honest with you about that, and I stand by it." Tracy recounted her experience almost word for word the way she told it to me, making me wonder if it wasn't rehearsed. I tried my best to hide my lack of interest, but what caught my attention was that she started embellishing it with additional details. The first time Ralph and I were close was the night after you left for Houston. If you remember, we were also close that night. So on Saturday, when you weren't at home, I still felt nervous, and in your absence I probably just craved companionship, so I invited Ralph to my place. He seemed to take my invitation as a sign, especially considering your absence, so he flirted with me more than usual. It seemed natural, just friends, and we started kissing. That's when I realized that we would end up upstairs in bed. It was really amazing. It was the first time I was close to someone other than you in 42 years of our life together. The realization that it was wrong only intensified the feeling. And after that, he behaved like a real gentleman. Our meeting was more intense than usual. And yet it seemed to me that two close friends were enjoying each other, and that was it. I didn't love him, and he didn't love me, but there was some kind of connection between us. After that, we hugged, as you and I do. "I loved you," I put in. "Mr. English," Dr. Swearingham scolded him. "We're friends, good friends, and surprisingly, I didn't feel as guilty as I thought I would." "So when you didn't notice, I figured as long as I didn't take anything away from you, we could still be friends and lovers. Even if you didn't come home early, you wouldn't know, and would still love me wholeheartedly, and we wouldn't be in this situation now. I didn't take anything from you. Can't we just pretend Sunday night never happened and go back to what we had? Is this all about your pride?" "And there it is," I exclaimed. "It's all about me and my fragile ego. Never mind that you've been cheating on me for over 5 years." "Well, our time is nearly up for today, Mr. English," Dr. Swearingham remarked. "But I must note that you weren't particularly cooperative today." "I didn't shoot her today, did I?" I retorted sarcastically. "Sarcasm won't help you here, Mr. English," the counselor added. I stormed out of the counselor's office feeling frustrated. Tracy attempted to strike up a conversation as we reached the parking lot, but I craved solitude, with only the hum of machinery for company. Slipping into my probe, I veered onto the highway heading east towards the Indiana border. Hours later, I pulled into a rest stop, refueled the car, pressed down on the accelerator, and headed home. This had become the routine of my life. The only solace I found was behind the wheel of a 16-year-old car. After our individual counseling sessions, Tracy and I were scheduled for a joint session. I didn't inquire about Tracy's discussion with the counselor. It wasn't something I cared to know, and she probably wouldn't have divulged anyway. Dr. Swearingham's direction with me left me puzzled. It seemed she was working hard to coax me into forgiving Tracy, while simultaneously emphasizing the consequences of not doing so, a lonely old age. "Here's where I'm at, Doc. Even when she's physically present, I feel alone. I used to see us as a unit, with myself as one half. But now she's disconnected me. There's no us anymore, it's just her and me as separate beings. She's focused solely on herself, disregarding our relationship. It's all about her, and then there's me and Ralph. I can't accept that situation," I explained. "But she claims she loves only you," Dr. Swearingham pointed out. "Her involvement with Ralph wasn't driven by love, she insists. It was purely physical." "Really, Doc? Et tu, Brute? You're supposed to be a trained therapist and counselor. Can't you see what's really happening?" "Well, Mr. English, why don't you share your perspective so I can understand your viewpoint?" she suggested. "Can I be blunt since it's just us? Or do I need to be tactful? I'm willing to be honest if you're open to it. Feel free, Mr. English, go ahead." "Firstly, I believe Tracy loves me, but perhaps not as deeply as before. Otherwise, she wouldn't have entertained the idea of being with another man. And call me traditional, but I don't buy into the 'it's just physical' excuse. She obviously has some emotional connection with this guy. She admits they're very close friends, which to me implies more than just friendship. Again, I don't think if you're truly committed, you develop feelings for someone else." As I spoke, I observed the doctor's expressions closely, noting her attempts to maintain a neutral demeanor. Nevertheless, I detected a couple of instances where she visibly reacted. "Doctor," I began, "when your spouse engages in intimate relations with another person in our own marital bed, what level of respect does that demonstrate towards you? And when considering the aspects of love and respect, what about the fact that she has been involved with this individual for over 5 years? A brief affair, perhaps, could be attributed to momentary desire. But 5 years? Does she take me for a fool? Even if it's purely physical, how am I supposed to overlook or forgive 5 years of infidelity? 5 years. Yet everyone seems fixated on the idea that because we're older, I should simply pardon her and move forward. But what difference does it make if I'm alone in our final years? I'm already alone. She abandoned me when she chose to engage with him. Whether I reside alone in an apartment or occupy a separate room in our home, the outcome is the same. I'm alone. And one more thing, Doctor. While she has expressed regret for causing me pain and for my discovery of her actions, she has never apologized for her conduct itself. She relished the attention of another man and willingly entered into an affair, yet she hasn't expressed any remorse. Did she ever convey any remorse to you? I rose from my seat and began to pace as I concluded my soliloquy. Exhausted, I collapsed back into the chair. "All valid points, Mr. English. We'll need to address them at our next meeting," remarked the other person. "Yeah, sure," I replied casually. With that, I stood and departed. Considering myself fairly astute, I was startled by my own naivety in the ensuing ambush during the meeting with Tracy and Dr. Swearingham the following week. "As we delve into resolving this impasse this week," Dr. Swearingham began, my head swimming, "let's start with Tracy. Dr. Swearingham, I don't want a divorce. I believe Andy and I can overcome this and return to where we once were, riding off into the sunset together. I realize now that while I apologized for hurting him, I never expressed true remorse for betraying his trust, and I know that has caused him pain as well. Andy, please. I'm truly sorry for what I did. Let's not end it like this after all these years. You're a better man than that." I glanced sideways at the doctor while Tracy was apologizing. There was a smirk on her face that disappeared as soon as I looked at her. The silence in my head was overwhelming. It's a good thing my parents taught me never to hit girls, otherwise I did something. "The fact that you've been close to him for more than 5 years shows that you don't regret it," I said when Dr. Swearingham began to object to my statements. "Maybe you regret that I slept with him once or twice. Maybe I'm sorry that I was a drunken idiot and broke my vows. But not, I've been sleeping with this guy for over 5 years and now I suddenly regret it. It doesn't suit me." Tracy appeared more than dismayed by my response. The doctor seemed shocked and was frantically scribbling notes. I was likely heeded for a reprimand for my attitude, but I couldn't contain my frustration. "We've been apart for, 2 months now?" I asked Tracy without expecting or waiting for a response. "How many times have you been with him since I left?" Tracy's face flushed bright red. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. The doctor's face mirrored the same shade of red. I wasn't sure if it was due to embarrassment over the unanswered question or my perceptiveness. For a fleeting moment, I felt a sense of pride. "Have you at least had the decency not to do it in what used to be our bed?" Tracy remained silent, suddenly fascinated by the carpet's texture. I stood, meeting the doctor's gaze squarely. She squirmed in her chair. "I'm not clever enough to determine if your actions today constitute an ethical breach, but I suspect they weren't entirely appropriate. I believe I'm finished with these sessions, and you'll need to inform the judge that you don't believe further counseling will be beneficial. Is that understood?" She sat there stunned as I got up to leave. "So, that's how it is," Tracy exclaimed. 39 years thrown away in an instant. I never thought you were so cold and vindictive. I suppose I held you in too high regard. And I never thought you were just a deceitful, promiscuous woman. My mistake, I replied softly as I departed. It had been about 6 years since I last visited Normal when I arrived at the funeral home's parking lot. Calling hours wouldn't start for another hour, but my daughter had asked me to come early for a private meeting before others arrived. She and my son-in-law, Ron, had the difficult task of making arrangements as requested by my ex-wife. They had arrived in Normal from D.C. 2 days earlier. Allison offered me the opportunity to assist with the arrangements, or to speak during the service or the meal following the funeral. She reminded me that despite the events, Tracy and I had a happy marriage of over 30 years, and I likely knew her better than anyone else. While that statement might have been accurate, I realized that I hadn't exchanged more than a few dozen sentences with her in the 8 years since our divorce. The last time we had a substantial conversation was during a visit to the kids' house when I happened to call, and she answered. Since our last meeting with Dr. Swearingham, there seemed to be nothing left to discuss, in my opinion. Allison quickly noticed my car arriving and dashed out of the funeral home, followed by Ron and my grandson. Although it had been a few months since my last visit to their house whenever we met, Allison never failed to greet me with a warm hug. True to form, she didn't let me down this time either, practically leaping into my arms like a teenager, despite being 47 years old. I had to take a step back when she landed on me, realizing that at 71, I wasn't as nimble as I once was. I embraced her tightly, then planted a kiss on her cheek before gently lowering her to the ground. Allie, this is Kay, my companion on this journey. I introduced the attractive woman who, despite being only 2 years older than my daughter, had emerged from the passenger side of the car. Kay kindly agreed to endure the 15-hour drive up I-55 with me. We took a brief stop about 30 minutes ago to freshen up after being on the road for 6 hours today. My daughter and son-in-law looked at me with surprise written all over their faces. You drove for 8 hours yesterday? At your age? Allison asked incredulously. And he wouldn't even let me take the wheel for a minute. Kay chimed in. You know your dad better than anyone, I suppose. He's quite particular about who gets to drive his Proby. I actually drove it before he did, Ron added. When I test drove it for Mom, before she bought it for him. Realizing his mistake, Ron's voice trailed off awkwardly. Sensing his discomfort, I quickly intervened to ease the tension. It turns out that was the final gift she ever gave me. And if she hadn't given it to me, I would have never discovered her infidelity. So for me, it was both a blessing and a curse. I suppose she always saw it as a curse, he reflected. All the way to the end, she insisted she loved you, Dad, Allison remarked. But she was resentful that you abandoned her, in her words. I just can't fathom what was going through her mind. She kept seeing that guy for another 3 years until he was transferred to Colorado. He never asked her to come with him. She was bitter towards him, too. Blamed him for your separation, I guess. Even on her deathbed, I don't think she ever realized she was the cause of our family falling apart. I didn't join Allison, Ron, and the kids at the front of the funeral home for the eulogy. I didn't feel it was my place. Whatever we had once shared was long in the past. Kay and I sat quietly in the back row throughout the service. The pastor delivered a touching tribute to Tracy. Many tears were shed, but not by me. I had already shed all my tears for Tracy a long time ago. After leaving the funeral home, we made our way back to Tracy's house, our former shared home. It felt surreal, encountering many old friends whom I hadn't seen in years, all offering their condolences. Kay remained steadfast by my side throughout, offering silent support by holding my hand at times when I seemed in need of reassurance. Upon entering the house, Allison welcomed us, and it felt like stepping into a time capsule. Everything appeared exactly as I remembered it. Tracy hadn't made any alterations. Noticing my surprise, Allison remarked, She left everything unchanged after you left, just in case you decided to return. She never even changed the locks, hoping you'd come back someday. If you still have your key, I bet it would still work. Nah, the only key I've kept from those days is for the probe, I replied, pulling the trophy from my pocket and displaying it. As Allison brewed coffee, I took charge of setting out cups and saucers for the 6 of us, familiar with where everything was. While we were busy in the kitchen, she leaned in close and whispered, You know, some people found it rude and tacky that you brought a younger companion to Mom's funeral. I have to admit, I didn't disagree with them. I arched my eyebrows and nodded as Alison poured coffee. Everyone gathered around the kitchen table with their cups. I took the opportunity to address the issue. As I mentioned earlier, Kay is my travel partner, not a romantic interest. We've been friends for years in Houston, and knowing I had a long and potentially stressful journey ahead, she offered to accompany me, I clarified. However, perhaps oversharing, especially in front of the grandchild, I suppose it would be more accurate to refer to her as a friend with benefits. One of many friends of that nature. The grandson chuckled while Allison and Ron exchanged surprised glances. Kay, who presides over the Quattro Queens Bridge Club, where I hold an honorary membership, introduced me to her circle about 8 years ago. We quickly formed a strong friendship and became frequent companions, especially in our games. Kay, being the generous person she is, gradually introduced me to her closest single friends, the other 3 members of the Bridge Club. These ladies, aged between 52 and 60, often seek company or an escort for various occasions, and I'm happy to assist when needed. I couldn't help but blush with embarrassment, prompting Kay to continue the story. As we've all reached a certain age, finding eligible single men like your father becomes quite challenging. So the 4 of us, or rather the 5 of us, reached an agreement. Our arrangement ensures we remain disease-free and free of jealousy, with a limit of only 2 participants at a time. We certainly don't want to overwhelm your dad. Allie and Ron still seem puzzled. Your father is surprisingly fit, given his age, dear. Nowadays, they have these little blue pills to assist with certain matters. And you know, a man's wit never dulls, does it? Allison and Ron practically had a light bulby moment of recognition. Their grandson found the entire conversation hysterical. Everyone, including myself, thought I would end up a lonely, bitter man for the rest of my days. I continued. Considering everything, I'd say things turned out pretty well for this old-timer.